Good morning. Good morning, Sarah.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well this morning. We want to welcome everybody to the introduction of how to create your next great employee. We're creating this program for those of you who are leaders, managers, supervisors at whatever level of mid-market and entrepreneurial businesses that you might sit and occupy, who have to and need to and want to hire people from time to time. So this is going to be a very practical application coffee talk program with Sarah and I leading the chat. And we thought that maybe the first place we would start is, if you're watching this, why would you ever want to listen to and spend some time with Sarah and I in this? So Sarah, talk a little bit about your background, and we'll chat just for a minute about why it makes sense to talk to us.
Okay, sure. I was in human resources for 21 years at an organization. I worked extensively with all aspects of HR, starting as a manager, moving all the way up through executive ranks. And I worked with recruiting and hiring extensively at all levels within the organization. And certainly through all those years, learned lots of best practices from my perspective, as well as from manager, CEO, and director perspective.
And you also saw the organization grow rather dramatically in your time there.
Yes, I did. Yeah, we were probably around 150 when I joined the organization. When I left, we were close to 700.
So that's a pretty dramatic rise, and it certainly complicates the recruiting and the whole process of how do you keep creating great employees when you go from 150 to 700 people.
Right. And also within that organization, we did go through multiple acquisitions. We were acquired 5 different times. We had ownership changes. So that was helpful as well in learning lots of different organizations, how they recruit. And again, just selecting best practices from each of those.
Right. So as many of you know, if you've tuned into CEOIQ, I bring the practical, hardcore business background to the process, coming from having been a CEO, sat in a CEO's chair, and a variety of operating roles in large and small businesses. So what Sarah and I are working on is to integrate that HR professional perspective with the practical, on the firing line business perspective as we talk about how to create your next great employee. So the first place to start for you CEOs and entrepreneurs, and particularly those of you who have started your business, is let's talk a little bit about your interpretation of HR and how you might view HR. Sarah, in working with executives, what are some of the things you've experienced around how people think about HR and the human resources role in organizations?
Well, yeah, and it's fascinating again because, as I mentioned, we went through 5 different acquisitions. I got to see firsthand how people interpreted human resources. I was very fortunate in starting my career in an entrepreneurial organization who valued human resources as a business partner. So I was pulled in to understand all the business issues so that I could then support, from a human resources perspective, all the things that were going on. In many organizations, HR was relegated to a personnel administration function, which again is very important. That's all of your compliance and all of those sorts of things, which can't be overlooked. However, there's so much more that human resources can bring to the table, being more of a business partner.
So one of the points we want to make with this, if you are a CEO or a senior leader in a mid-market privately held business and you view human resources as personnel administration, we're going to invite you to reimagine your view of human resources, because to just relegate it to, in your mind, personnel administration, you are really shorting yourself in terms of what you can and should be thinking about doing with HR. Now, the first thing we want to emphasize in inviting you to reimagine your view is that if you have an HR officer in your company, you need to remember that their first role, their first responsibility is basically to keep you out of jail. And what I mean by that is, in today's world, HR has a huge focus on compliance issues. Sarah, that's become just an enormous time commitment on the part of HR executives.
Absolutely. Because certainly with hiring and recruiting in particular, there are many ways that you have to be careful from a legal perspective. questions you're answering, how you're screening, who you're saying is an applicant or isn't an applicant. But that's certainly a large scope, which shouldn't be, I don't want to cover in this particular session, because what I think this
Right.
one's going to be much more about is the practical application on how to interview and how to make sure you're finding and retaining and grabbing that right employee.
That's a great point. We want to emphasize that we are going to stay out of legal in this program, how to create your next great employee. If you have employees, particularly if you have more than 20 employees and you don't have an HR person on staff, you need to have an HR attorney on retainer as part of your legal representation. We're going to stay out of that and move into the whole building a cohesive team should include your HR person, and so that's where we want you to think about it. So now let's talk about, do you have an HR person or not in terms of your recruiting activity? That are you on your own for hiring when you think about hiring the next person, or do you have an HR person that you want to bring into the loop on this? Sarah, what does that look like for the executives watching our program?
Well, what's really nice about the program that we've put together is that we're going to tell you the process, which will be whether you have an HR person or not. Now, certainly when we go through certain steps, if you have an HR person, their role will be clear in the process. However, if you don't, you're going to apply the same principles. It'll just be you or someone else within your organization assuming some of those responsibilities.
And so what we want to do is create a process for you to think about, and we're going to emphasize in a couple of the modules being much better as an interviewer evaluating candidates in this process. And if you have HR, putting HR on the team as a business partner to create your next great employee, rather than saying, well, their job is to fill out the forms and get the benefits stuff right and all that once somebody comes on board is where we want to focus. We've laid this out as a process that there are certain steps you need to go through. You need to think about how you're going to prepare. You need to think about how you're going to get ready to approach the interviewing process. And then we're going to talk a lot about where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in the interview. Because one of the things we found is that there are tons of resources out there for candidates to do what the recruiters call candidate grooming, to present yourself as positively as possible, to answer the questions in the way you think the interviewer wants them to be answered. And then, of course, Sarah, there's the problem of too often interviewers are so uncomfortable with the process that they let the candidate control the conversation.
Well, I think in general, oftentimes a manager, whomever, is so busy doing their actual day-to-day job that they relegate this to I'm going to toss this over the fence to HR or to whomever because I'm too busy. I don't have time to focus on this. And I think that's a critical mistake that people make, because ultimately that's an investment in your number one resource, which are the people on your team. And if you don't take the time up front to really define what you want and be an active participant in finding them, there's no way you're going to get that next great employee. It's just not going to happen because you're not going to be involved in that process.
So it's very important to understand, don't vault over the wall to HR and say, deliver me a new person who can do this 2 weeks from Monday.
Correct.
And of course, if you're hiring at a more senior level, then it's even more important to be involved. Right. That brings us a little bit to the topic we've talked about, this notion of when we use the term hiring a manager in this series of videos. And we want to talk about that. If we use that term, and you'll hear Sarah and I use it frequently, that we're talking about you're the person hiring somebody who's going to report to you. Okay. I get some confusion sometimes from CEOs about, well, does that mean I need to hire a whole nother HR person who's in charge of hiring? That's not the point. If we use hiring manager, it means you're the person hiring somebody who's going to report to you. Okay. Sarah, talk about how people ought to think about approaching this program and walking through it with us.
Sure. Well, We've created the program in modules that are small, 10 to 15 minutes, that'll give you a topic and will actually give you some learning takeaways from that particular topic. We also have put in templates and things that'll help you take the information we give you and apply it back in your work, back in your everyday work. I think we would prefer that you follow this all the way. It is a process of how to define your position and then ultimately how to bring that person on board. However, at any given point, you can cherry pick a topic. It will be self-contained. Say it's, creating interview questions. You can do that. We recommend following the whole process, but certainly as people get busy, you could always come and just pick one particular module and go through that.
Well, we also want to recognize that in your entrepreneurial impatience, what we often call fire ready aim, that you may want to dive right in somewhere. So if you choose to do that, dive right in, recognize there's a lot more out in this program than we're at the point that you pick to dive right in, so to speak. All right. Well, we want to welcome you. We're going to start in the next segment by talking a little bit about the playing field. So welcome to How to Create Your Next Great Employee. We hope you enjoy the journey with us.